This is your sort of wrap-up lecture for your module on storytelling. And in this lecture, what we're going to try to do is sort of bring all the things we've been talking about together, so hopefully we can wrap it up into a package, moving on to do your assessment, and then we can go on to the next part of the course. So where are we at the moment? Where have we got to? So we've looked a lot at mark making. So we look at the notion of mark making as putting something down on a piece of paper. So the kind of things you've been doing, through your drawings and your photographs. So we talk about that as a form of mark making. So what does mark making allow us to do? What does it make us, give us the capability to do? What mark making lets us do, and this is an important move, and Bronwyn spoke about this 2 weeks ago, is that all of a sudden, when we start putting things down on a piece of paper, we are codifying things, we're making things real, right? When you speak, it doesn't allow you to transmit that information, it doesn't create a record of that information. Anything that you speak is here now and then it disappears. So when we started making marks, be it through the drawing of maps in the sand, or the writing of what we did, the stories that we engaged in cave paintings and so on and so forth, what he started doing was starting to fix meaning, starting to attempt to create a story that could then be transmitted and retold. That is a really important part of how we've come about as a species, right? The ability to put something down on a piece of paper or a wall or whatever that then we can use to explain to another person. This is the starting of, basically the standardization of language, the fixing of meaning. Things can have multiple meanings, but once you start putting it down for other people to understand it, you actually have to arrive at a position where you have a sort of conventional understanding of what those things mean. This idea of starting to fix meaning means we can start having larger conversations. We're not spending the constant conversation debating or arguing about what we're trying to actually talk about when the conventions aren't clear. So what mark making allows for, it allows for the fixing of meaning. That means we're starting to say these things mean these things and nothing else. But we're also then starting to say these things are a snapshot of that space and time. Right? Some of you spoke about this in the class, in the tutorials, about photographs, how photographs are about that particular space at that particular time, and then things move on. When you start doing mark making, that also allows for that. One of the other things that mark making allows us to do is to record knowledge. Now, through history, we've lost a lot of libraries and we've lost a lot of knowledge. So there's a lot of things that we don't know. That's why you hear the things about, the mysteries of the pyramids, the mysteries of, the Stone Age and all those things, Mayan civilization, Inca civilization. What did those things mean? We don't really know. We're always guessing. We're trying to interpret. So a lot of knowledge has been lost, right? If you read about the vast library that existed at Alexandria that was burned down, we don't know what information we lost. We don't know how much is set back mathematics, science. When you start talking about written text, there are fragments of text that we have. There's stories of what we know the text is supposed to be saying, but the text, the original way it's written down, it's gone. Right? So what do you do when you put marks down on a piece of paper? It creates that knowledge, makes it permanent, makes it mobile, makes it transferable. Which means in order to teach someone, you actually need to be able to put things on a piece of paper. You need to be able to make a mark so you can start engaging in sort of creating culture, creating religion, creating a way of thinking. So mark making is the beginning of, in some ways you could say, a knowledge society. We use that word in a different version in contemporary terms. But if we just look at the idea that we're talking about, the codification of knowledge and the ability to move that knowledge across space and time, mark making is really important for that. How do the marks tell a story? Each mark in of its own is meaningless. And those of you who did the different sort of drawings, you realized that the marks that you made told a particular story that might not be what the audience has received. All right? So marks help you tell that story, and the more marks you have, the clearer and more focused the story gets. So marks help you tell a story because the meanings are fixed. The meanings are fixed. A collection of meanings coming together are more focused in what you're trying to say. So if I just say the word dog, that in itself doesn't say very much. It could be a variety of things. If I add the word qualities of, that becomes a bit more clearer. I'm not actually talking about a physical object anymore, but I'm talking about something that's qualified by the word quality. Do I mean literal quality, as in dogs are furry? Dogs have wet noses, those are qualities. Or am I talking about perhaps more metaphorical qualities, such as dog is man's best friend, or dogs are loyal, right? There's the other meaning of dog, as in Australian context, which is a traitor, not a nice person. That guy is a dog because he betrayed his friends. So even the word dog in itself doesn't mean all that much. When you qualify it with another series of words, it still is ambiguous. So you need to constantly put more marks down to make the message more focused. So in the exercise that we did in class, where we looked at trying to tell the same story with the photograph and the drawing, you should have then realized the relationship between the number of elements you have or marks in a drawing and how well it can convey that information. There is a threshold there where you have to put enough down so that the audience can understand what you're saying, and enough down so that you can control to as much extent what the audience understands. So marks are part of that relationship. What are the constraints? So we gave you some constraints. Static frame, 2 color, minimalist, right? The other constraint we gave you was photograph. This week's homework, 5 frames, not 10 frames, 5 frames. So there are all these constraints on the kind of things you can make and how you can communicate a message. Every object has constraints to it. So in your design vernacular, you should be fairly familiar with words such as scale, perspective, foreground, background, negative space, white space. All of these elements come together to constrain the type of things you can do. So last week, the 2 or 3 of you that went for Stephen Benham's lecture would have heard you talking about printing and how printing works and the kind of things you could and could not do with printing. That is a highly constrained way of working. So every time you're doing something, one of the key things you've got to understand is there are constraints to what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot achieve. Some constraints might be technical, right? So this might be the amount of ink you have available, the type of paper you have available, the amount of space you have available, the fidelity of the object, the number of pixels you have on the screen. All those kinds of things are technical constraints. And then there can be conceptual constraints. All right? Which means you might be working with a client that has a particular idea they want to convey in a particular way. The ideas that they want to deal with are very simple and focused, or they have a very clear sense of it. So that can be another type of constraint. Your familiarity with ideas and your familiarity with the world outside of this place is also a constraint. So last week we spoke about what can you do to become a better designer tomorrow, right? The more constrained you are in your knowledge, the less you can actually use the different elements that are out there in the world. So your own limitations in terms of what you know is a constraint. So your ability to tell a story is constrained by your own experience, your own knowledge, and the kind of things you have and have not engaged in. Those are constraints. And lastly, we talked a few weeks ago about the idea of literacies or languages, the way you portray the world and how the audience sees the world. So you yourself are a constraint, but so is the world in which you're going out there to communicate. You don't have a blank slate of people you're talking to. You're not always talking to people who are like yourself. Sometimes you're talking to people who are very unlike yourself. Well, how do you find out how they think? You're all, what, 20 to 25, mostly out of high school. If I asked you to design something for someone who's a senior, 60, 65, you would then have to try to think, what is the type of person I'm going to talk to? What are their ideological frames? What are the literacies that they have and have not? Now, we have a tendency to sit down and pontificate about what we think that these people's literacies are. But there's actually a way to go finding that out, which is to do research, to look at demographics, psychographics, other things that are out there, consumption habits, and so on and so forth. So when you start working and trying to make a design solution, you actually have to think about what are the constraints to me making that object, to me telling that story. That is very much part of that experience. And the last thing that we spent a lot of time talking about, it was the notion of authorship. Who is actually telling the story? Are you the person telling the story? Is the audience the person telling the story? And in these activities that you did, you should have by now realized that you actually have a limited control over what you can convey in terms of meaning. The constraints that are put on your output have an impact on who ends up telling the story. So one of the key things we want to try to move towards is to become communication designers that are strategic, that know how to use the right tactics to achieve the strategy, and have an awareness and a conscious execution of tactics. Now, these are the kind of ideas we'll expand a bit more tomorrow in class. But basically, it boils down to this. You must have a strategy. What is the overall aim that you're trying to achieve? Your tactics are the methods that you use to achieve those aims. And your conscious and deliberate and aware execution means you know exactly why you're doing everything that you do in your design solution. We spoke about the idea of moving away from instinctive design to actually being conscious and aware of why you do the things that you do. So if you know things like rule of thirds, golden ratio, and all those kinds of things, that's good. It means you actually have awareness of why you position things, or where you put things on a piece of paper, what is the reasoning behind it. You might already be doing it now unconsciously, or subconsciously rather, but you need to move on to the stage where you're aware of these things so you can deploy them to achieve the outcomes you want to achieve. All right? So those are the things we want to try to get to. Again, just a caveat here. You are only 7 weeks through your semester, 6 weeks, sorry. 6 weeks through your semester. So you still have a while to go. But these are the kind of things that need to start underpinning what you do. So we're not done yet. We're only starting to uncover these ideas. And these are the kind of things you have to use to motivate what else that you do next. So we've talked about mark making and storytelling and the constraints and the notion of the audience. Now we want to look at the notion of time-space. So you would have had a quick experience of the notion of time-space just by moving from single frame to 5 frames. All of a sudden in your activity that you've done, you've moved from having a slice of time to 5 slices of time, from having 1 space to having 5 spaces. How you move across that space becomes really important. Now, when we talk about communication, the time-space dimension is a really important one. At its most basic, the way to think about time and space is this. We all move within time, we all move within space. We conceptualize our relationship with space very often through time. So if I ask you, where do you live? You'll say, I live in Werribee. All right, let's say. Actually, I don't know where Werribee is. Let's say you live in Castlemaine. All right, you live in Castlemaine. All right, how far is Castlemaine? It's an hour on the train. You don't say it's X number of kilometers. You don't say it's X number of train stops. You don't say it's that X number of revolutions of the tires, right? You measure these things in time. So a lot of times we measure our spaces in time. We measure how we sit in a space in time. How long are you going to be at the lecture? I'm going to be at the lecture in 50 minutes. You're fixed in this space for that period of time. This is a simplistic way of thinking about it. There's more complex ideas, but as long as we start thinking about that. Another way to think about space and time, particularly for us communicators, is to understand how things move through space and time. So from here to somewhere like, let's say, Melbourne University, how far is it? How long would it take in a tram? 5 minutes? How long if you were to cycle? 15 minutes? How long if you were to send a letter? 2 days? These are all different forms of communication, right? If you had a story to tell to someone in Melbourne Uni, if you send them a letter, you go, okay, it's going to take them 2 days to get that story. If I cycle there and walk there, it's going to take 30 minutes for me to tell them the story. If I cycle there, 15 minutes. Tram, 5 minutes. If I call them or I email them, immediate. So that distance between you at RMIT and your friend at Melbourne Uni is conceptualized through time. Communication and media is that relationship of how you send that information across that space, across time. So whether it's email, phone calls, so on and so forth, all those things become quite important. So when we spoke about mark making as fixing something onto a piece of paper, that allows you to move that idea across space and time. So if you go to Tabilt Winery in Nagambie, right? It's about 150 kilometers away from Melbourne, I think, 2.5 hours drive. There's a steam engine there. The steam engine there was brought in the mid-1800s. Now you might think, what's the big deal that a steam engine was brought from the mid-1800s to Nagambie? What's the big deal? It was the first steam-powered wine press in Australia. All right, what's the big deal? It had to come from London. It had to be made in London, it had to be put on a ship, there had to be an engineer attached to it. The engineer had to come to Melbourne, find horses or carts and all that kind of stuff to bring it across before the Hume Highway existed, all kinds of rickety roads and so on, to a little winery 150 kilometers away, which is a long way away. Cape Otway, do you know where Cape Otway is? How far is Cape Otway from Melbourne? Shipwreck Coast. Do you know Shipwreck Coast? You guys need to get out there. It's a beautiful piece of the country. It's about 2.5 hours, 3 hours away. But when ships used to crash on that coast, hence Shipwreck Coast, it used to take up to 2 weeks for the people to get to Melbourne. So our modern concepts of distance and time are not the same as people from years ago. So we might look at them and go, wow, what's the big deal? Just up the road. But it's through time, as technology has progressed, the time-space has been brought closer and closer together. In the communication arena, you think about the same thing. If you don't have a printing press, you have to get information from somewhere else. So before Australia had a printing press, it would get its printed material from places like Singapore, where the British had a big presence, from London, from Europe, and so on, which means information was always behind the times of when it happened. All right? So time-space dimensions and way of thinking for us communication designers, or for communication practitioners, is a really important way of understanding what communication does, what media does. When you make a mark on an object, you're fixing it in time and space. Whether it's on a book or a CD or a website, it means where it can go and how it can cross that space is really important. So for us, one of the things we need to think about is the notion of mobility. All right? We are highly mobile people. We move around a lot. All right? Some of you will go halfway across the globe during winter. Some of you will go 7,000 kilometers north because you want a bit of sun for a week or two in winter. That is an amazing, unfathomable distance 100 years ago. When the kangaroo route first started, that means London to Australia, Sydney, on Qantas, it used to take 3 odd days to fly from London to Sydney. I think it was 5 or 7 stops when it first started. Now it's 24 hours with 1 stop. That's in like 30 years or so, or 50 years, something like that. But you're looking at that distance of 14,000 kilometers being shrunk and compressed down to 24 hours, right? So this idea of being mobile people means information and communication is highly mobile. So we talked about this last week in class. When you make something and it's digital and it lives on the net, time and space almost becomes irrelevant. In that case, that information, that artifact, that photograph, that drawing you've made is instantaneously available anywhere in the world. So all of a sudden, space is no longer important. So you are highly mobile. The things that you make are highly mobile. The things that you consume are highly mobile. So this has led to a situation where time and space, some people argue, is obsolete. It's being crushed to the point of being irrelevant, right? So you might look at your habits as well, that you're on the communication loop almost consistently. You're getting WhatsApps and Vibers and SMSs and Facebook chats and all that kind of stuff throughout the day, depending on where your friends are. So you wake up in the morning, you have your Melbourne friends. 3 hours later, your Singapore friends, Malaysia friends come on board. 5 hours later, people in India come on board, and so on and so forth. 10 hours later, people in London come on board. So when you're shutting your day down here, your friends in London are starting their communication with you, and it's happening like that. That is quite an astounding thing, which means the distance is now being compressed to the point of almost being irrelevant for digital communication, right? So you can have production cycles that are continuous. If you get a brief from your client in London in the afternoon, they will expect when they get into the office in the morning, you've done it because of the time difference. That's what's happening to the world. That's what happens to films. Films get filmed in a country, digitally uploaded, and processed in another location, such that the next day the director can see the processed film, and so on and so forth. So production cycles have become compressed. And you will find that now, especially with design, a lot of stuff works like that. You get a brief when you get to your office in the morning, and your London or New York office expects it to get when they come into the office in the morning. So in that way, your work days become continuous. So there's no sense of being separated from your office in New York, London, Tokyo, or Melbourne. So what this means, we talk about a notion of distanciation. I can see a few faces that are sort of going, what is all this? These are fairly complex ideas. They're there to really get you to understand where your practice sits, okay? Distanciation is the idea that you're taking your social engagements and ripping them out from space and time. What do I mean by that? So if you look at the way traditional society was, your ability to have a relationship is determined by how you can move, right? If I can only engage with the village next to me, which is 4 hours walk away, and the next village is 2 days away, my social life, my engagement will be limited by how far I can move across space. So my social investments, my community is where I am. And as, let's say you get a horse, right? Or you get a motorbike, or you get a bicycle, or you get a car, all of a sudden your social space is bigger than before. If time-space gets compressed to the point that it's almost irrelevant, your social engagements are global. You belong to global communities, right? So some of you who might be fans of various games or movies or whatever, you're getting that information, you're engaging with people, if you're on message boards all over the world at different times. People, and you can be highly invested in those communities. What does that mean for you? Which means you actually now going to compete in that global marketplace. If your social relations are disembedded from space. So is your work life. So is your conceptual space. And that is one of the hardest things to think about. So last week we spoke about the KFC ads. And there's tons of examples about this where something is put out with the idea that this is for the local market, but because of what the world is now, anything that's put into the global space is now available for everybody to consume. So all of a sudden you're competing in a different marketplace. So the idea that your social relations, your engagements, your investments are no longer limited by where you are, but rather how well you're connected, means there's a significant shift in the way we can think about how we will end up working. All right? So when we talk about mark making or storytelling and the constraints that are there and who the audience is and comprehension and those things, you got to understand where you're working in, the kind of space you're located in. So some people talk about the idea that fixed spatiality is dead. The idea that you're fixed in that space and time. Right? I know of someone who works for a design school in California, but she lives in Brunswick, right? Because it's an online university. All the lectures, all the assessments, everything is done by this lady who lives in Brunswick for a school that's based in California. You don't have to go to California to study in that school. So it's a very different way of thinking about the world. And Australia, unfortunately, tends to be behind the rest of the world. So what you want to try to do is try to get as far ahead of the curve as you can. So how do all these things try to work within the storytelling sphere? So we're going to try to unpack this a bit more. So someone asked me the other day, what's the simple way of thinking about storytelling? And because you asked me, this is the simplest version I could come up with. The difference between storytelling and any other form of communication. To me, storytelling is the emotive and persuasive expression of ideas. All right? And these expression of ideas are of a particular ideological position. That means they're telling a story from a particular way of seeing the world. As a storyteller, you're not just laying out the facts. Werner Herzog, who's one of my favorite directors, has this great quote about the notion of truth in documentary, but I think it applies to us. He said if that was important, the greatest documentary would be a man reading the telephone directory, because everything in the telephone directory is true. That number belongs to that person. But that would be one of the most boring stories to listen to. Stories work because you make an emotional connection with your audience, and you're then trying to persuade them to do something, to buy something, to engage in a particular type of behavior, or to not engage in a particular type of behavior. And that motivation is an expression of a particular viewpoint of the world. So to me, storytelling is just that. It's not as a simple way of thinking about it as it can be. It's just, to me, this would be the simplest way to put it. I think the emotional bit is important. The persuasive bit is really important, especially for communication practitioners. You're always out there to persuade, right? And the ideological position we're going to explore a bit more in the next few slides. The other thing I want to talk about is the notion of constrained meaning, just as a little sort of, please note. Every story is within the range of meanings that constrain its meaning. What I'm trying to say here is every time you're trying to tell a story, how you tell the story, what you tell the story with, the elements you use, the language you use, the literacies you expect from your audience, all those constraints that we spoke about work to, as far as possible, constrain both the creator and the audience. So all those constraints work on you when you're trying to tell the story, but they're also working on the audience. The ultimate you want to get to is a situation where both your constraints and the audience's constraints can mesh so that the story is as persuasive as possible. That's one of the hardest things to get to. So to me, we're thinking about storytelling. That's what I think storytelling is. So we start expanding that a little bit more. Stories reflect certain ideologies and serve as carriers of these ideologies. So we look at the story of something like Apple. right? And I see a slew of Apple laptops in front of me, and that's okay. I've almost every Apple product, unfortunately. Apple years ago had a very effective way of positioning itself in the market. Apple is creative, Apple is fun, Apple is sexy, Apple is different. But within Apple, it is embedded a certain ideology of the role of the individual in a community. Apple inherently will only work its message if you believe that the individual is important, perhaps even more so than a community. If you come from a culture that is highly conformist or highly communal, the idea of doing something to stick out, to be different from everyone, would be a problematic way of seeing the world. Right? So if that is the problem within which you're working, the Apple message is not effective. If your culture says you cannot be different, you're part of society, don't stand out, don't be the tall poppy, you're members of the same group, you will not be the one out there being different, right? Then you get outgrouped. So the stories that we tell reflect certain ways of thinking, and as such become then vessels for carrying the message forward. So there's a lot of writing that's been done over the past about propaganda, and I'm not going to talk about propaganda, but inherent in every communication is a belief system. We've talked a lot about this. And when you send that message out there that is embedded with these belief systems, the person receiving it, you're trying to persuade them not just with the message, but also to agree with your belief system. Which is why people get so worked up about films like Noah, or is it called Noah's Ark? You know the new film? Noah. Everyone's getting worked, not everyone, a particular group of people are getting worked up about it because to them it is diluting a particular ideological viewpoint, particular way of thinking about the world, and it's not truthful to that, right? And the worry is that if people see that happening, they will think, oh, it dilutes the previous ideological position. So we'll try to unpack. There's a few slides where we try to unpack this. So as you as a storyteller, got to be aware that you're very much involved in the production of ideology, in the maintenance ideology, and the contestations of ideology. Three different parts. First part we know, making, right? You, with the way you see the world and your lenses and your literacies, you make a particular thing that you might not be aware of that has a particular message, although we want to get you to a position where you become aware. The constant production of similar objects helps maintain that ideology. All right? You need that to be constantly produced. One movie out there is not going to change a viewpoint. One ad campaign is not going to change the world. You need other things to maintain that dominant way of thinking. But while that's going on, there's always contestations, which means there's always people putting out there messages or ideas that challenge that way of thinking. So we think about a debate around same-sex marriage or gay rights or equality rights or whatever, right? There's a contestation of those ideas. There is the dominant narrative of the heteronormity of society. The way we see a culture, films, music, is heteronomous. So every time something that comes out that doesn't fit that dominant ideology, it's actually something that we notice, but it's something that's then asking, I want to play in that space too. I want to be a dominant idea or at least have a voice. And then you see that contestation going on. Okay? So what is ideology? Ideology is an organized collection of ideas that create a normative position, but that are constantly contested and changing. We spoke about normative positions, I think, in week 1, right? The idea that there's a sense of what is normal, which is a highly problematic word, or at least what is the dominant way of thinking, right? The common sense position, you could say, that's normative. But this is always being challenged. There is no fixed normal. Right? Heteronormity is a fixed norm, but it's always being contested. If you go to an AFL game and you see the men on the field running around, hugging each other and whatnot, that is constantly, in my mind, contesting heteronormity, right? Which makes people argue that the game itself is actually extremely what do you call it? Homoerotic. We can talk about that in class. It's another discussion. But the idea that there's a constant contestation of the norm. So women, gender roles. There's a sense of there is a gender role, right? So that's why there's all these debates around what the role of the men is, or something as simple as paternity leave, right? Because that is change. That is contesting the idea that women are the primary carers, and men occasionally only need 2 weeks. Those are things that are out there contesting meaning, contesting ideas. The dominant ideology, and we spoke about this in class, dominant ideology. You have a dominant ideology. You're born, you do some stuff, you go to school, you do some stuff well, you get told you're good at this stuff, right? Then you go to university, you do more of the stuff. Then you go out, you get a job with doing more of the stuff. Then you find someone, then you get married. Then you try to buy a property, although that's very hard. You got to get a car. Then you have kids, and then you have to send them to private school. And then they do well, and then you will be happy. And then you have grandkids, and then you die. That's a dominant narrative. You all know this narrative. Nothing I'm telling you is shocking to you. That is the dominant narrative. But now there's challenges to dominant narratives. Dominant challenges such as people going, I'm not going to buy a house. I'm just going to rent for the rest of my life. Oh, I'm not going to get married. I'm just going to live with this person. Oh, I'm not going to be reproducing. I'm not going to have any kids. Oh, blah, blah. All these things are fighting with the dominant story. And different cultures have different dominant stories. So this dominant ideology is constantly being challenged by alternative and subjugated, which means repressed knowledges. So this grand narrative of society. So in Australia, the grand narrative, mateship, the battler, right? What else do we have? Fair go. All of these are very much part of the dominant narrative. There's very little mateship. Most people don't get a fair go, right? What's the other one I said? Mateship, fair go. The battler. Most battlers earn more money than the mean average, right? Being highly leveraged in debt doesn't make you a battler. That makes you a bad consumer. But again, that's another thing we can argue in class. But there is a grand narrative and it's constantly being challenged. So one of the best ways just to think about what's the grand narrative of your group or your society or your culture, what do we think what is common sense? It's the way things are. That's what you're supposed to do. All right? You're supposed to do these things. That's how you're supposed to behave. Why can't you just do that? Those are the things that we do every day without questioning. Right? We just think that's why we're here. That's what we do. Okay? So, when we talk about these ideas, they're coming from somewhere. So we go back to the idea of mark making. All those marks that you make are coming from an ideological position. And 2 weeks ago, we spoke about trying to understand where you're coming from. So everything that you make is coming from a position of belief. You have a certain set of beliefs. You're then putting it out there in the world to engage with other belief systems. But because you're a communication practitioner, you actually have to have a strategy, which is, why are you doing it? What do you hope to achieve? You hope to persuade and have an emotional relationship with the audience. How do I do it? What are my tactics? This is how I'm going to do it. This is why I'm doing it. All right? Then you think about, what are the constraints to me being able to achieve that? What's the audience literacy? How does the audience see the world? That's the space in which you're going to engage. And that space, my friends, is an ideological battlefield. Now, you might think, I just want to make stuff and tell stories. I don't engage in ideological battles. So you don't have to. But what I'm saying is, anything you put out there goes into a space that's contested. Right? Nothing that you put out there will not be argued against. So you have to understand, you have to have a strategy, you have to have the right tactics, and then you've got to execute them within the constraints that are out there. So it's actually a really difficult space to be in. So the challenge for you is to say to yourself, where does this leave me? How can I become a better communication designer? It's the kind of things we've spoken about today are not solutions. They're not, this is it. You're going to hear this lecture and you're going to go out there and change the world. hopefully what you're listening to today is giving you things to think about. You're starting to go, okay, there's these ideas. Words have been dropped in front of you, normative positions, ideology, conventions, belief systems. These are all ways of thinking to trigger you to think about how can I be the best communication designer I can be? Because that's the space you're going to live in. You have to, and also last bit, when we talk about notions of strategy, tactics, and then execution, all right? They're actually really complicated ideas. So everything that I've put in front of you today is not easy consumption. I understand that. It's not meant to be easy consumption. This is university. It's meant to be hard. But what it needs to do is spur you on to start having a greater awareness of yourself as a communication designer. To understand that the difference between a communicator, which we all do, everyone on the street communicates, to a communication designer is that you have a strategic approach to communication. Communication is banal. Communication is boring. It's ordinary. It's not interesting. But when you apply your skills to it, communication becomes strategic, it becomes interesting, it becomes emotive, and you're trying to persuade the audience to do something, to buy something, to change a habit, or something or the other. That is your greater purpose as a communication designer. That is the challenge that is in front of you. And that is the thing you have to try to unpack. All right? So we will continue to explore this in the second half of the course as well. We're going to do some interesting things in the second half. But also in the second semester, we will continue to explore these ideas. So if they're a bit jarring and a bit sort of difficult to get your head around, that's okay. As long as you actually do feel a bit uncomfortable with this and a bit out of sync, then we've got where we want to go. All right? Any questions? Nothing? Crystal clear lecture as usual? All right, so for those of you who are coming to the makeup class, it's in building 9. The rest of you, we'll see you tomorrow in class. Bring your homework, and thank you all for coming.